I'm talking about morphic resonance, and it's a hypothesis about memory in nature. The basic idea is there's a memory inherent in nature. And this shines forth in various ways. One of them is through the so-called laws of nature, which I think are more like habits. I think the habits of nature evolve along with the universe, rather than all being fixed laws that were there at the beginning. The hypothesis also says that each species has a kind of collective memory, a bit like what Jung called the collective unconscious, and that each member of the species draws on the collective memory of the species and in turn contributes to it. The hypothesis also leads to a completely new interpretation of inheritance. It's not all in the genes, or even in epigenetics. And perhaps the most radical aspect is that it leads to a reinterpretation of the nature of memory. Memory is not stored inside our brains. I'm sure you've all been brought up to believe that it is, but I'm going to suggest it's not. The brains are more like tuning systems that tune into memory through morphic resonance, rather than memory stores that have it all stored inside the brain. So, this is obviously controversial because it goes against the standard assumption in Western science that nature is governed by fixed laws that were all there at the moment of the Big Bang. The normal assumption is that at the moment of the Big Bang, all the matter and energy in the universe appeared from nowhere, and all the laws that govern it suddenly appeared and have governed it ever since in exactly the same way. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the assumption that all the laws of nature suddenly appeared together with all the matter and energy in the universe. I just don't think that's the case. And I think one of the reasons why we have to consider the idea of memory in nature, whether we like it or not, is because we now have a radically evolutionary cosmology. The idea that nature is fixed comes to us from Greek philosophy, and it's now in headlong conflict with the idea that everything evolves, which is rooted in the Jewish part of our cultural heritage. The ancient Greeks thought that ultimate reality was eternal and changeless. And they probably got this idea through mystical experience, where many mystics find that through mystical insight they arrive at a realm which is beyond space and time. The Greeks tried to turn it into a philosophy of nature, and different philosophers came up with different theories about what the ultimate eternal reality was. Pythagoras, in his school of thought, said the ultimate reality was mathematics, which are outside space and time that give rise to the universe we live in. And mathematics is essentially changeless. Numbers, proportions, ratios lead to changeless truths. Plato generalized Pythagoras' idea to the idea that ultimate reality is a realm of forms or ideas beyond space and time. The Platonic realm of forms and ideas included mathematics, but it went further. It had the archetypes of all species, for example, an ideal form of a horse, or a horse essence, which all individual horses reflect or participate in, but which remains outside space and time. The atomist school of thought in ancient Greece, the prototypic materialists, said that ultimate reality was matter. Matter was made of lots of little bits, atoms that never changed. But they moved around and repermutated in different patterns, and they underlay the changes in the world. Very different theories of eternal reality. All of these were resurrected in the 17th century at the beginning of modern science. And the idea was that the laws of nature are mathematical ideas in the mind of a mathematical God. Mathematicians and physicists very much like the idea of God as a mathematician because it makes them the most godlike of people, and also creates a kind of high priesthood because they're the only ones who can really understand ultimate reality. The rest of us, who don't know so much about mathematics, just have to take their word for it. They also revived the idea of atoms, changeless particles of matter. Of course, we now know that atoms can change, but this was built into the foundations of modern science. And right up until 1966, scientists took it for granted that the universe was made up of a fixed amount of matter and energy, and that the laws of nature were totally fixed. But this came into conflict with the other great idea in Western thought. From the Jewish heritage, the Jews were the only ancient people who had the idea of history as a progressive development. And the prototype for this was the journey of the Jewish people out of bondage in Egypt through the wilderness to the Promised Land. So it was a journey with a goal. And the goal was something like the recreation of Eden in the land flowing with milk and honey. Of course, when they arrived there, then as now, it was full of Palestinians. So it turned out not to be a paradise, and there was nothing but trouble. And so the idea of this end of history was projected into the future, the coming of the Messiah. For Christians, Jesus was the Messiah, but then history didn't come to an end. So it was then projected to the second coming of Jesus, when ordinary history would come to an end. Well, this basic idea of an end to ordinary history became the basis of a whole lot of millenarian movements during the Middle Ages. One of the most important was in late around 980, when everyone thought that at the coming of the millennium, the year 1000, everything would transform. This led to the Y1K problem. But it didn't, and so then there were a series of other millenarian movements. And this whole way of thinking was secularized in the 17th century here in England by Francis Bacon, who came up with the idea that there would indeed be a transformation of humanity in the planet, but it wouldn't happen through divine intervention. It would happen through what we now call science and technology. Humans would acquire, as he put it, empire over the universe. That we would be able to dominate and control nature through science and technology, which would lead to economic growth and progress. This is now the ideology of every government in the world, and it leads to an extremely progressivist view of history. By the end of the 18th century, it was the standard philosophy of Enlightenment intellectuals all over Europe and North America. But it only applied to humans. The rest of nature was seen to be static. With Darwin's theory of evolution in 1859, this progressivist evolutionary view was extended to all life. But the physicists said, well, it doesn't apply to the universe, that's just a big machine that's running out of steam according to the second law of thermodynamics, and it will finally freeze up and just last forever in a final heat death. And physicists clung to the idea of an eternal universe until 1966, when the Big Bang cosmology became the orthodoxy of physics. And that says the universe began about 14 billion years ago, and it's been growing and expanding and cooling ever since, and new things have been appearing within it throughout the whole of this evolutionary process. So now the whole of reality is evolutionary, not just humans, not just life, but the whole universe. Now, if the whole universe is evolutionary, what about the laws of nature? How can we really say that all the laws of nature were there fixed at the moment of the Big Bang? It made sense when people thought the universe was eternal. But if the universe is evolutionary, why can't the laws evolve? And in fact, as soon as you think about it, you realize that the idea of laws of nature is a metaphor. It's based on the idea of human laws, and only humans have laws. They don't occur anywhere else in nature. But it's based on the idea of laws, human laws, governing nature being eternal. It's a rather shaky metaphor, very anthropocentric. I think a much better conception of the universe would be evolutionary laws, because human laws do, of course, evolve. The laws of Britain are not the same today as they were 100 years ago. But even better is the metaphor of habit, that humans have habits, animals have habits, nature has habits. I think the whole universe is governed by habits, not laws. Now, this is a very shocking idea in Western philosophy because we're so steeped in Greek assumptions. But in Eastern philosophy, in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, the idea of a memory in nature is completely standard. I first thought of this idea of morphic resonance when I was at Darwin in Cambridge. And it was very hard to get the idea across to my fellow scientists in Cambridge. I then worked in India. I lived there for 7 years. I worked in an agricultural institute, the International Crops Research Institute in Hyderabad. And when I discussed this with my Indian colleagues, I got a completely different reaction. What they said is, oh, there is nothing new in this idea. Ancient rishis have said it thousands of years ago. And so basically their attitude was, well, memory in nature, you know, tell us something new. That's what we've always thought. And Buddhists have something rather similar. So it's a worldview that I found no resistance at all in India to this idea. The resistance came in when I said, well, why not actually test it scientifically? And they didn't want to rock the boat of conventional science. But the idea there was a memory in nature made a lot of sense from that point of view. Anyway, this is a hypothesis, and it's a scientifically testable one. And how I formulate the idea of habit is in terms of the idea of what I call morphic resonance. The word morphic comes from the Greek word morphe, which means form or shape. And resonance is the automatic influence of a particular pattern of vibration on another pattern of vibration. We're used to it from the idea of acoustic resonance, stretched strings in a piano. If you put the sustaining pedal on and you chant into a piano, you go ooh into a piano, it will echo back ooh. There's a kind of resonance. If you chant e, it will echo back e. Different overtones resonate with different strings on the piano. We also have resonance in radio. When you tune in a particular frequency on the radio, it's a resonant phenomenon. We have resonance in magnetic spin resonance, as in fMRI machines. We have it in electron spin resonance. There's many kinds of resonance in nature. What I'm proposing is something that's similar to them in the sense it's about a pattern of vibration. Everything in nature is vibratory, even atoms and electrons. All vibrations happen in patterns. It's different in the sense that the resonance occurs across space and time and doesn't involve a transfer of energy, but rather of information. Anyway, that's the hypothesis in a nutshell. It's written up in detail in my books, The Presence of the Past and A New Science of Life. So if you want the details, you can find them there, plus material on my website, sheldrake.org. What I need to do now is just talk about some of the ways you can test this, how it can be tested scientifically. One way of testing it is with crystals. If you make a new chemical compound for the first time, and chemical companies and universities make thousands of new chemicals every year, the first time you try to crystallize it, there won't be a morphic pattern for that crystallization because it's never happened before. But once you've got crystals, the second time anyone makes it anywhere on the Earth, or perhaps throughout the whole universe, it should crystallize easier because there's already been a pattern established. There's already a kind of memory in nature. The third time you make it, you'll have an influence from the first and second crystals. It should happen easier and quicker. The fourth time, even quicker because of the first, second, and third lot of crystals, acting at a distance across space and time, but from the past. Now, does this actually happen? The answer is yes, that it's well known to chemists that when you make new compounds, they're difficult to crystallize. They take a long time before you can get a new crystal. But once you've formed crystals in one lab, it seems to get easier everywhere else. And as time goes on, it gets easier and easier. Now, chemists don't usually explain this in terms of morphic resonance. They explain it in terms of stories or anecdotes. They assume that this happens because fragments of previous crystals get carried from lab to lab as seeds or dust. And it's known that bits of previous crystals can make crystallization happen quicker. They act as nuclei for new crystallization processes. So they just assume this happens because of migratory chemists carrying them from lab to lab, especially bearded chemists, or else that invisible dust particles have wafted through the atmosphere and have settled out all over the world, causing things to crystallize faster. But I'm suggesting this should happen even if you exclude migratory chemists and filter dust out of the atmosphere. It should still happen quicker. I haven't been able to persuade any of them to do that actual test. But there's another way you can test it with crystals. As the crystal habit becomes better established, as things become easier to crystallize, and as the crystal habit is stronger, it should be harder to break things up. And that means you need a higher temperature to break up the crystal. The melting point should increase. So the melting points of new compounds should actually increase over time. Whereas the melting points of compounds that crystallize in nature and have done for millions of years have so much morphic resonance from the past, they behave as if they're governed by eternal laws. There's millions and millions of past crystals. You don't notice the difference with a few dozen more. There's already evidence, which I summarize in my books, that melting points of new compounds do in fact increase. These are not tiny effects. Sometimes it's 10, 15, 20 degrees centigrade. And so I think this is another way the theory is testable, and through which there's already evidence. The hypothesis can be tested in biology as well, and I won't go into those details today, but again you can read about them. It can also be tested in animal behavior. The same applies to the activity of brains. Particular patterns of activity in brains and in movement, in muscle movement, in body movements, also have a morphic resonance. If you train rats to learn a new trick in London, rats all around the world should be able to learn the same trick quicker just because the rats have learned it here. And again, there's already evidence that this actually happens. Dramatic increases in rates of learning in rats in laboratories were observed in a series of experiments started at Harvard and carried on in Edinburgh and in Melbourne, Australia, showing more than about 15-fold increases in the rate of learning, enormous increases in the rate of learning. And it turned out that this was not just in rats whose parents had been trained, but in any rats of that breed. So it was something that was mysterious when it was discovered, and because it couldn't be explained, it was more or less shelved and forgotten about. So there's already evidence this happens. In the human realm, it should be getting easier to learn snowboarding, skating, skateboarding, skydiving, all these new skills that have appeared since the beginning of the 20th century. There's a whole lot of new physical and mental skills, computer programming, video game playing. All of them should be getting easier, and they are. But it's not, there's other things at work, not just morphic resonance. There's better designs, better training methods, videos on YouTube, etc. To test the hypothesis, you need to look at something where the actual tests are quantitative and haven't changed over long periods. And this applies to intelligence tests. In the 1980s, I predicted that because of morphic resonance, the average scores on intelligence tests should be getting better, not because people are getting smarter, but because the tests are getting easier because so many people have already done them. And indeed, in the 1990s, it turned out that exactly this has been happening. Average IQs have gone up in Britain, America, Germany, in fact all over the world, by about 30% since 1920. And there's no independent evidence that people are 30% smarter. I think it's just because the tests are getting easier. It was discovered by a psychologist called James Flynn. It's called the Flynn effect. And this is something which is extremely baffling to psychologists, but fits very well with morphic resonance. There's many other tests that can be done and have been done in the realm of human learning. I summarize them in the appendix to the new edition of my book, A New Science of Life. One of them I mentioned because it was an idea my older son thought of, which when he was doing GCSE with his friends, he came up to me and said, my friends and I have thought of a way of getting extra marks in our exam without doing extra work. So I thought, well, how are you going to do that? I said. And he said, by morphic resonance. And I said, well, how do you do that? He said, well, say in the physics paper there'd be 15 questions. He said, we'll do questions 14 and 15 first, then we'll go back to 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So we'll be about 10 minutes behind everyone else in Britain. So we'll get a boost by morphic resonance. And so I said, I think that's a really good idea. I said to him, but some of your friends must have been morphic resonance skeptics. What did they say? And he said, well, yes. He said, some of them were. They said, what if morphic resonance doesn't really happen? He said, we worked out if it doesn't really happen, we wouldn't lose anything, but if it did, we'd get extra points and extra scores. Well, they all actually did it in their exam, and they all got A stars. But they were bright anyway, so not the perfect test. It turned out a friend of mine from Cambridge was in charge of the OCR science examinations panel. And so I talked to him and I said, look, we could turn the whole of these science exams into a giant morphic resonance experiment by having a minority of the questions put in a different order in a random sample of the paper. If people who did those later got higher scores, if they were doing those questions later in the exam. Because of course everyone does them synchronized to avoid people ringing up and telling their friends the questions. If they did them later, then got higher scores, it would be a fantastic test of morphic resonance. First he was interested, but he rang me a few days later and he said, Rupert, he said, I'm due to retire soon and I want to make sure I get a full pension. And he said, if I turn our whole school science exam system into a giant morphic resonance experiment, that's not going to happen. So unfortunately it didn't happen, but it's still a good idea, and that would be another possible test. There are many possible simple tests, but that would have cost almost nothing, just printing a few papers that examined the questions in a different order. Anyway, it's a testable hypothesis. There's already quite a lot of evidence that supports it. And so what I want to do now is to discuss some of the implications. One of them is in the realm of heredity. We've all been brought up to believe that heredity is coded in the genes. So many people use the words hereditary and genetic as if they're synonyms, as if everything you inherit is somehow inherited in the chemical genes, or possibly in epigenetic modifications of the genes. Well, I've always thought that genes are overrated, and when in the 1980s I went around saying genes are overrated, most people thought I was joking. But I was quite sincere, because what genes do is code for the sequence of amino acids in proteins. We know what they do. They enable the body to make certain proteins, but they don't code for the shape of your nose or the shape of your arms or the instinctive web-spinning behavior of a spider or the migratory behavior of a cuckoo. These things are not proteins. They're things that are a very much higher level of organization, and there's no simple one-to-one relationship between proteins and these characteristics. Where genetics works best is where there's a simple relationship with the gene to a single protein. For example, sickle cell anemia. If you have a defective hemoglobin molecule because of a defect in the hemoglobin gene, then you have sickle cell anemia. In cystic fibrosis, a single gene mutation will give this hereditary disease. But for most of our inheritance, there's no such simple relationship at all. And I think most of the inheritance of form, instinct, and behavior works by morphic resonance, not by genes. Well, this was actually put to the test. And the Human Genome Project was initiated in the 1980s, and it was initiated partly because biologists suffered from then as now from physics envy. They were very envious of physicists who had very big projects like Star Wars and giant colliders and atom smashers and hydrogen bombs and things, whereas biology was a kind of cottage industry. And they didn't have multi-billion-dollar programs, so they wanted to think of something that could make biology have what they called big science. But they had to have an idea that was simple enough to explain to President Reagan. And they came up with the Human Genome Project, and that we can read the book of life as it's written in our genes, and this will be a historic accomplishment, and the whole of human nature will be revealed at the genetic level. That was the promise, and people said it will lead to individualized medicine, it will lead to a whole new kinds of biotechnology and so on. They got billions of dollars in funding. There were two genome projects, the public one and the private one, run by a firm called Cellular Genomics, which was run by a highly competitive alpha male type scientist called Craig Venter. And he saw this as a competition to beat the human project by the public genome project by the private one. In fact, they both sequenced the genome around the same time, in the year 2000. They expected about 100,000 genes, and Joe Venter was planning to patent all the key ones and then own the rights to these genes. Well, it didn't quite work out as planned. It turned out there were only about 23,000 genes, only a few more than a fruit fly, and less than a sea urchin, only about half as many as a rice plant. So that was the first shock. And then it turned out these genes didn't explain anything like what they thought they would. By about 5 years ago, tens of thousands of genomes had been sequenced, and they did a series of studies called genome-wide association studies. They did 30,000 genomes, and they looked at characteristics of the people whose genes had been analyzed. And one of the things they looked at was height. It's very easy to measure height. All you need is a tape measure. And it was already known that tall parents tend to have tall children, and small, short parents, short children. If you knew the parents' height, you can predict the children's height with an accuracy of about 80%. In other words, to use the technical word, height is about 80% heritable. So they looked at the genes for height, and they found that there were about 50 genes involved in influencing height. Then they made the best models they could. Some genes are more important than others. Using these very best models, they predicted the height of people on the basis of their genes. They were able to predict it with an accuracy of 5%. Well, just by using a tape measure, you could predict it with an accuracy of 80%. Billions of dollars cheaper. The gap between the 5% they could actually predict and the 80% that was known to be inherited, is called the missing heritability problem. And it now turns out that this applies to many things. The prediction of breast cancer, for example, they can get an accuracy of about 5 to 10%. With most diseases, it's 5 to 10%. With most characteristics, the only ones where you've got a really high accuracy is with single gene rare inherited diseases like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia. So this led to a great deal of soul searching in the realm of biology. Steve Jones, the geneticist at University College, said, well, if the genes aren't explaining inheritance, then what does? Then some people thought the whole thing had been saved by epigenetics. Those of you who studied biology, well, not many people here studied biology in the 20th century, but until about the year 2000, the biggest taboo in biology was the inheritance of acquired characters. You can't inherit what parents learn or acquire. You can only inherit the genes that they inherited. So there was Lamarckian inheritance, or the inheritance of acquired characters, was a massive taboo in biology. And people who advocated it were usually drummed out of their positions, and it was a serious heresy, persecuted quite mercilessly in the West. In the Soviet Union, on the other hand, it was the orthodoxy, and Mendelian geneticists were persecuted mercilessly, so that made it even more polarized and difficult. However, since the year 2000, the inheritance of acquired characteristics is really back in fashion in a big way. It's been rebranded epigenetic inheritance, and it's now one of the hot topics within biological research. People are now doing experiments that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. For example, there was an experiment on the inheritance of fear in rats, a paper published in Nature, the most prestigious of all scientific journals. It was called Inheriting the Fears of Fathers. Male rats were made afraid of the smell of a synthetic chemical called acetophenone. It smells a bit like cherries. Whenever they smelt it, they were given an electric shock. It was one of those classic old-style conditioning type experiments. So after a few times, whenever they smelt acetophenone, they were paralyzed with fear. They then took sperm from these male mice, inseminated female mice, so the mothers never met these fathers, and looked at their children and grandchildren. And their children and grandchildren were paralyzed with fear when they smelt acetophenone. They'd inherited this fear from their fathers in a way that couldn't possibly be explained by genetic mutations, as in neo-Darwinism, but which could be an epigenetic effect. It was clearly an inheritance that wasn't to do with changing the genes. It could have been due to changing the way the genes are expressed, but even then it's a big stretch, because how could learning to avoid this spell actually affect the epigenetics, the packaging of the genes in the sperm of the mice? There's no known mechanism whereby that could happen. Morphic resonance would provide a much easier explanation for this kind of result. Right now, within biology, people are doing experiments of this kind, coming up with really surprising hereditary effects. And they get permission to do that. They wouldn't have permission to do it if it was morphic resonance, which is still treated as heretical. But by saying it's epigenetic, even though they can't explain how it actually happens, then it's okay to do this research. So we're in a very interesting situation with epigenetics at the moment. Some people think that epigenetics will explain the missing heritability problem. Well, epigenetic gene modifications may explain some of it, but certainly not all of it. And I think morphic resonance is largely what's responsible for this unexplained inheritance. One of the reasons that people thought that genes were exceptionally important in inheritance was through studies on identical twins separated soon after birth. As you all know, there's been a long-standing debate going back at least 200 years about the relative importance of nature and nurture, genes and environment. On the whole, people on the right of the political spectrum prefer the idea of genes or nature because it means people are born unequal and there's not much you can do about it. But people on the left of the political spectrum like the idea that genes don't code for as much as as the environment. So if you can reform education and social institutions, you can improve human nature and overcome these genetic problems if human nature is malleable through the environment. So studies on identical twins separated soon after birth became the key line of research for this. Because they have identical genes, being identical twins, and different environments, because they're adopted by different families, this provides a good way of looking for the relative importance of nature and nurture. It turns out that identical twins raised in quite separate families who've never met each other are extraordinarily similar in many ways that no one expected. For example, calling their children by the same names in some cases, things you would never expect to be inside genes. The result of these identical twin studies have led to people saying, well, look, there's a very high degree of genetic determinism. And this is the edifice on which selfish gene theory, sociobiology is built. The idea that there's a very high level of genetic determinism. And this is now the orthodoxy of biology, of neo-Darwinism, and so on. But you see, there's another possible explanation. If identical twins are similar, which they are, then even if they're separated at birth, they'll resonate with each other by morphic resonance, which depends on similarity. They're more similar than any other people to each other, so they'll influence each other continuously as they develop in life, and all sorts of things they learn or acquire will become easier for the other one to learn or acquire, or habits they have. And so the similarities could largely reflect morphic resonance rather than genes. But that's not something that's ever taken into account in these debates. It's either genes or environment. And the fact they're so similar, for most people, proves it must be largely genes. That's why the missing heritability problem was such an enormous shock. And it's provoked a kind of crisis. Some people in biology say, we must have missed something out, which I'm sure they have. Others say, well, it's just because we haven't looked at enough minor modifier genes, and just give us another $10 billion and a few more years, and 10, 20 more years, and we'll figure this one out. That's the majority approach. But it's very much an open question now. I discuss this in detail in my book, The Science Delusion, if any of you want further references on this. So, if morphic resonance depends on similarity, as I'm suggesting it does, then you can ask another question. Who in the past was most similar to me? And if you think about it, the person in the past who was most similar to you is you. We're most similar to ourselves in the past, and therefore the most specific resonance working upon us from the past is from our own past. We have some resonance less specific from people who are similar to us in the past, members of our family, people who are similar in inheritance and in culture and environment, and ultimately to all human beings, but there's difference of degrees of similarity. Jung's idea of the collective unconscious is of a human unconscious on which we draw. We draw more on that which is people more similar to us, less on those that are less similar. But the most similar of all is yourself. And I think that our ordinary memory depends on morphic resonance, that collective memory and individual memory are different in degree, not in kind. So, I think that the memories you have of where you went for your holidays this year, things that happened as a child, and so on, are not all stored inside your brain. The conventional view is that somewhere they're inside your head in modified nerve endings or phosphorylated proteins. People have spent 100 years looking for these memory traces and haven't found them. So instead of assuming that they may not be there, people have just say, oh, we've got to look harder. They must be stored holographically over large regions of the brain, or they're very elusive, or something like that. I think there's a much simpler explanation for the fact people have been so unsuccessful in finding them. They're not there. And it's like me coming to your house and trying to find out what you watched on TV last night by analysing the wires and transistors. It wouldn't tell me what you watched. They don't leave traces, these programs. So I think our brains are more like TV receivers tuning in by morphic resonance to the past than like video recorders or solid disk recorders, storing it all in a physical form inside the brain. There's good evidence that there are specific changes in brains while memories are being laid down from optogenetic methods and other sophisticated modern techniques, and specific changes when memories are being retrieved. But in between, they just disappear. So I think what's happening is that when they're laid down, there's a pattern of activity, and when they're retrieved, there's a resonance with that pattern of activity, but in between, they're not inside the brain. Now, this has a lot of implications. Many of these ideas have implications in philosophy and in the realm of religion as well. For example, if memories are all stored inside your brain, then when you die, all your memories will be wiped out because your brain decays, and if they're all in the brain, total wipeout of every memory. But all religions presuppose that something of us survives the death of the body and is carried over in some non-material form. For example, in theories of reincarnation in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, there's a transfer of memory or of habits or of dispositions from one life to another through reincarnation or rebirth. If there was no transfer, the whole doctrine would become meaningless. And if all the memories and all the things that people have learned or all their dispositions decay when they die, then this whole doctrine, this whole philosophy would not be meaningful at all. In theories of survival, as spirits or in an ancestral realm, again, there has to be some kind of memory. In the Catholic theory of survival of bodily death in purgatory, which I understand as a kind of dreamlike state that you go into after you die, you go on dreaming, but you can't wake up anymore. The kinds of dreams you have depend on the kind of person you are, your beliefs, expectations, hopes, fears, and so on. Again, those presuppose memories. In extreme Protestant after-death scenarios, where you go to sleep when you die, and then you're woken at the last trump for the final judgment, if you appear before your Maker forgetting who you are and what you've done, it wouldn't be a very meaningful experience. So all of these hypotheses of life after death presuppose the survival of memory. Now, if memories are not stored in the brain, then they're not going to be eliminated at death. It doesn't show how they're going to be retrieved, but it leaves the door open for hypotheses about survival of bodily death, whereas the materialist theory slams the door shut. not because there's firm scientific evidence for it, but simply because for a materialist everything is material, therefore memories must be material, whether you can find them in the brain or not. There's no alternative, they've got to be. So it's just an assumption, really. It's one of the 10 dogmas of contemporary science, which I discuss in my book, The Science Delusion. Now, coming to, I've been talking about memory and inheritance in nature, because the same applies to inheritance of pattern and form in plants. The same applies to the structure of planets and galaxies. I want to come to rituals. All cultures have rituals, and all rituals have a particularly conservative character. People do them the same way they've been done before, often using the same language that's been used before. In the Brahminic rituals of India, they use Sanskrit, which no one speaks in normal life. In the Russian Orthodox Church, they use Old Slavonic. Again, it's not a living language. In the Coptic Church of Egypt, in the liturgy, they use ancient Egyptian language, which is not spoken anywhere else. It's the only survival of the ancient Egyptian tongue in the Coptic Christian liturgy. So there's a conservatism of language, also of gestures, of forms. So rituals are highly conservative. Why should that be? Well, I think morphic resonance provides some kind of explanation for this, because if people do things as similarly as possible to the way they've been done before, then they'll enter into morphic resonance with all those who've done them in the past. There'll be a presence of the past through performing the ritual, right back to the first time the ritual was done. And this is exactly what people who do rituals think is happening. For example, the Passover ritual, the Jewish Passover ritual, involves reenacting every year at Passover the Passover dinner of the Jewish people just before they left Egypt to start on the journey through the wilderness to the Promised Land. It involved killing a lamb, smearing the blood of the lamb on the lintel of the house to avoid this plague on the rest of Egypt, which killed the firstborn of people and their cattle as well. The Jewish people were passed over because of this ritual of killing this lamb, which was like a sacrificial victim, eating the lamb in a special way with bitter herbs and so on. Ever since then, Jewish people have reenacted this every year at Passover. And by doing so, to explicitly connect with the very first time it happened, and all those who've done it in the years that passed. These rituals are about incorporating people within social groups and connecting with the ancestors. They perform a very important social role for social cohesion, identity, and connection with the past. The Christian Holy Communion is itself a Passover meal, the last meal shared between Jesus and his disciples. And it's reenacted in every Holy Communion. And those who take part are connected with the first time it happened, and all those who've done it ever since, which in Christian terminology is called the Communion of Saints. The idea that what's called the blessed company of all faithful people, all those who've participated ever since the first Last Supper till now, you're linked by participating with them. Secular rituals have the same format. The American Thanksgiving dinner, which happens later this month, is a reenactment of the first Thanksgiving dinner of the first settlers in New England who gave thanks for their survival through the first year in the New World. And it's a dinner of Thanksgiving, which, by taking part in it, people become American. It's the way in which they affirm their American identity and their connection with the first settlers in New England. So rituals all have this kind of character of linking the present participants with those who've done it before. They make a great deal of sense in terms of morphic resonance, but from the kind of rationalistic, materialist point of view, they're just mumbo-jumbo. But I think this is something that people, most cultures depend on these rituals to give a sense of meaning and continuity to the culture. If you take them away, there's a kind of vacuum and rootlessness. I think these things also apply to places. If you're in a place where many people have prayed or worshipped, or like a cathedral, for example, one of the ancient cathedrals or places of pilgrimage, or a temple in India, for example, then I think when you're there, you tune in by morphic resonance to other people who've been in the same place before. You tune into a kind of collective memory. Conversely, if you're in a place where bad things have happened, you may pick up a rather unpleasant kind of memory, a sort of uneasy memory. And it's interesting that most stories of hauntings or ghosts are associated with stories of bad things that have happened in that place. I think pilgrimages are one way of connecting with these sacred places, and I'm very interested that the Advaya group actually went on a pilgrimage, 2 pilgrimages, earlier this year. And there's been a revival of pilgrimage here in Britain, and it's open to everyone. Connecting to these ancient sacred places is a marvelous way of connecting to the history of the place and being present in nature, being present to the environment, and being present to other people, because when you're on a pilgrim, all distinctions of social status and rank are abolished. I know that Guy, who's here today, who leads some of these pilgrimages, has been doing them with people from all walks and backgrounds, including some in this room, but also with the Duke and Duchess of Norfolk, for example. So they too have been pilgrims this year, walking just like ordinary people, anonymously, through the countryside. It's a marvelous way of reconnecting. So there are many other ways in which, many other implications of morphic resonance, but it's basically a theory of habit in nature. It explains why things remain the same, why things continue, why there are influences across time stabilizing things. It doesn't explain creativity, because creative things are not the same as what's happened before, by definition. I think evolution involves an interplay between habit and creativity, as our own lives do. We can think of all sorts of new ideas when animals or plants mutate or produce new varieties. Not all of them are successful, not all our new ideas are good ideas. There's a natural selection that selects some rather than others. And the ones that pass natural selection, the ones that are selected for by natural selection, are repeated. They are repeated more and more often, they become more habitual. So I think there's an interplay of habit and creativity within the evolutionary process. And in terms of innovations, cultural innovations, morphic resonance, on the one hand, it might seem pessimistic, old habits die hard. On the other hand, it's optimistic, new patterns or innovations can spread quicker than they might otherwise. So it has a mixed message in terms of human affairs.